Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. How should we characterize events playing out in Ukraine? A legitimate democratic movement or a small number of highly motivated radicals forcing violent regime change? Is this movement as peaceful as Western media claims? And is Ukraine hopelessly divided, West against East? To CrossTalk Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, John Laughland, in Paris. He is the Director of Studies at the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation. In London, we have Tony Halpin. He is a journalist and a former Moscow bureau chief for The Times. And in Moscow, we cross to Dmitry Babich. He's a political analyst with Voice of Russia. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. John, if I can go to you in Paris, the government has resigned. The cabinet has resigned. Yanukovych has reached out to the opposition. So is the ball in his corner or the opposition's?
Well, in a sense, it's in the opposition's, because they have been making the running in this. As you said in your question, they have, or you implied anyway in your question, they have shown extreme violence, the opposition. They have shown themselves to be very radical. They've demanded, of course, the resignation of the president, which they haven't yet obtained. And the government, for the most part, has responded with proposals of compromise. The earlier proposals to appoint one of their members as prime minister was rejected, and now the compromise has taken a different form and has included, of course, as you know, the repeal of certain laws. I think it is in their ball, although the ball is in their court. But at the same time, what strikes me in this whole affair is how incredibly weak and fragile the Ukrainian state obviously is. We had demonstrations here in Paris on Sunday demanding the resignation of the French president. And the idea that those demonstrators, who were about 16 or 17,000, could have left the authorized demonstration place and gone and occupied the Ministry of Agriculture nearby is completely incredible. And the fact that the demonstrators were able to occupy that ministry on Friday and then the Ministry of Justice the day before yesterday shows that this state is a state which really is extremely fragile indeed.
Tony, how do you reflect upon that? Because Yanukovych, for better or worse, he's making compromises. He did over the weekend. It was rejected by the opposition. I mean, what more do they want? After all, Mr. Yanukovych is democratically elected and recognized by Western capitals and everyone else in the world. The electorate spoke. Why do they need him removed now?
Well, I think it has to be recognized that the trigger for this latest round of the crisis, which has been going on already for more than a couple of months, was the passing of these repressive laws on January the 16th, which have now been repealed in a hurry today. And the reason those laws have been repealed is because of the reaction it produced from people on the streets. They were designed specifically to criminalize people who had until that point been demonstrating peacefully for the most part.
Tony, but does that justify the violence? Did that justify the violence on the part of the protesters later? Did that justify violence?
No, violence is deplorable, but when you're in a revolutionary situation, it's inevitable that extremists get attracted to large-scale demonstrations. And the responsibility for creating that situation, unfortunately, lay with the government and President Yanukovych, who ramrodded these laws through Parliament in a matter of a few minutes, without debate, with very questionable voting procedures, which had been introduced only 2 days prior. If the democratic path had been closed, as it was, to the demonstrators and to the opposition, they're left with only one response, which is to take to the streets, and unfortunately that's what happened. Happily now, the democratic track seems to have been restored today, and so we would expect the opposition and the authorities to try and negotiate a resolution.
That's where I want to go. Dima here in Moscow, would you describe the opposition as democratic?
No, unfortunately, I absolutely disagree with Tony on that one. I think that first we should remember that violence started back in December, before these laws which Tony deposed so much were passed. They were passed on January the 16th.
Yes, the riot police attacked peaceful demonstrators on November 30th.
And right after that, a group of radically minded protesters, I would not like to call them that name, but they tried to attack the presidential administration. And you remember how terrible was the fight there. But what I want to say is that one of the laws that was repealed today is the law that criminalizes denying the Nazi crimes in Ukraine. And here, I think it's very important what I'm going to say. I'm not going to call these people protesters. I'm going to call them neo-Nazis. And here's why I'm doing that. Today, in the mayor of Kiev, they have this portrait of this man, Stepan Bandera, the head of the Ukrainian nationalists who helped the German Nazis invade Ukraine in 1941. I have in my hands, this is a magazine. This is not a Russian magazine. This is a Polish magazine. It shows Mr. Bandera's face, and it says, Bandera, a regular terrorist. Bandera and his men killed thousands of Jews, Poles, Russians in Ukraine. They killed also tens of thousands of Ukrainians. And somehow he is the only man whose portrait these people are carrying. And if you look at the so-called protesters, you will see that there are Ukrainian flags and there are many red and black flags. These are the flags of the so-called Ukrainian insurgent army.
Okay,
so,
Dima,
I don't call these people protesters. They are neo-Nazis.
You made your point. John, would you reflect upon that? Because one of the reasons why I wanted to do this program is that it seems to me most of Western media, mainstream media, likes to overlook this. Not everyone, but most people do. Why?
Well, because the so-called pro-European Nazis are pro-Europeans, and that's what counts. I mean, Dmitry is quite right to draw attention to the ideological soil in which a part of the opposition movement in Ukraine has grown. And there is absolutely no doubt, and I know this through direct experience, that part of it is rooted in nationalism. But there is violence, I think, in the DNA of the Ukrainian opposition more profoundly. After all, Mr. Klitschko's party is called Punch. Udar in Russian means punch in Ukrainian as well. He is a boxer, and he has now presented himself onto the political scene, but clearly as a man who wishes to embody still as a politician the kind of violence that he practiced when he was a boxer. I think when such situations escalate, there's always the question of who started it. Did the police start it on the 30th of November, or did the demonstrators? I've certainly seen plenty of videos of demonstrators attacking the police with incredible brutality, including, of course, pictures of police being burned. And those videos date from back in December, as Dmitry said. But ultimately, I think the fault, if you like, the political fault, because after all, a situation on the street can explode at any time, does lie with the European Union. When the Ukrainian opposition back in September last year decided to include the Svoboda, the extreme right-wing Svoboda party, in its ranks, the European Union turned a blind eye, even though it must have perfectly well known that these people are the same kind of people that they attack as fascists when they're in Hungary or in France. And the European Union, because of its geopolitical agenda, turned a blind eye to that and has ever since, as I say, given indirect support at least to the kind of violence that we've seen on the streets. And that is extremely regrettable, because I think the real danger is the breakup of Ukraine itself.
Okay, we'll get to that point, and we'll get to that point soon enough. Tony, can I go to you? Because, again, I mean, in the information age, you can see a lot of different videos, okay? And we all in media know that you can make things or give a certain spin to it. But looking at a lot of those videos here, when I look at the protesters, I see rioters. I don't see democracy. I see a lot of really negative symbols from the past, and Dima Babich on the program has mentioned it. How do you reflect upon that?
Well, I'm curious about Dima's argument. Is it your contention, Dima, that everybody on the streets of Kiev and other cities are part of some grand fascist conspiracy? I mean, it simply isn't the case.
I can respond.
Euromaidan came into being.
Okay,
these people, a lot of them are holding slogans. Ukraina понад усё. That means Ukraine is above all. This is a translation of the German Deutschland über alles. When you see a slogan like that and you are a normal person, you leave, even if you don't like the government.
Okay,
you
Dima,
don't stand under such
you
slogans.
made your point. Go ahead, Tony, continue, please.
All kinds of people can chant what they like, but the contention that you put forward is that these people are neo-fascists. It's clearly not the case. The Euromaidan began as a protest against the about-turn of President Yanukovych in a matter of days, from deciding to sign the association agreement with the European Union to rejecting that agreement without preparing in any way his electorate. Therefore, he got a response from those who were unhappy with that decision, as I repeat. The demonstrations that took place were overwhelmingly peaceful for a number of months until the point where laws were passed in very rapid succession with no democratic
who is in control of this opposition now? In your mind, Tony, who do you think is in charge of these opposition groups right now? Is it organized, or they just can't control some? Because there's certainly violence being committed on the streets there, and it's not only the authorities.
Well, I think the very big question today in Ukraine is whether anyone's in control. The government has resigned. President Yanukovych, his reputation is clearly severely dented, and the opposition is a very fragmented group of people who don't really have a recognizable single leader. The way forward in those circumstances, and it's one of the opposition demands, is to put the decision to the people to elect their leaders. Whether that comes out of what are still ongoing negotiations, we'll have to see. But it is a very big question whether anybody currently has the democratic legitimacy to enforce their decisions.
Okay, but John, I mean, we did have an election. Yanukovych was elected and was recognized by the electorate and was recognized by the international community. Just because you have a riot doesn't mean you have to have an election. I mean, then you should have elections in the European Union all the time. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't agree with what Tony has just said. As you've just said in your question, Peter, the election of the president was not contested by anybody, and nor was the parliamentary election which brought his party to power. The decision not to sign the agreement with Brussels was a totally legitimate decision. Under no circumstances can that be called a reason for removing a government from power. And as for these so-called repressive anti-demonstration laws, again, this is a caricature. The laws prohibiting the wearing of masks and helmets, these laws exist in many European states, including in France, where I live. In France, you're not allowed to go about on the street with your face covered, and you're certainly not allowed to take part in a demonstration.
All right, gentlemen, I'm afraid I have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. All right, Dima, I'd like to go back to you here in Moscow. Where do we go from here? Because we started out the program is that Mr. Yanukovych is making a number of concessions here. What's the opposition going to do? What should they do for the welfare of the entirety of Ukraine? Because over the years, it looks more and more like Ukraine can't stay together the way it is. Go ahead, Dima.
Well, I don't want to advise the so-called opposition because I just told you, I think any normal person, when he sees the slogan like Deutschland über alles or Ukraine über alles, when he sees that slogan, he leaves. So I'm not prepared to advise these people what they should do. I understand why Mr. Azarov quit. If you want, you can go to the YouTube and watch videos how he's been insulted in the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, how they call him a Russian prostitute, how they hurl papers at him, all of these people from the nationalist factions. And I would say that I don't know what the situation will be with the European Union, because the European Union, in fact, rammed through its agenda. Yanukovych suggested a number of compromises. He suggested trilateral negotiations between Russia, Ukraine, and the European Union. The EU said, no, it's only between you and us. Yanukovych suggested changing the association agreement. The EU said, no, it's going to be the way we wrote it. So the EU is not accepting compromises. And the so-called opposition is not accepting compromises. In this situation, I'm not sure Russia will be able to disburse the economic aid that it promised to Ukraine, because this economic aid consists in buying Ukraine's government bonds. Why should Russia buy the government bonds of a government that will obviously be controlled by anti-Russian people? The US doesn't buy Iranian government bonds. And the rhetoric which Mr. Yatsenyuk and Mr. Klitschko and Mr. Taknikbok used towards Russia is very much like the rhetoric that the Iranian mullahs use against the United States. We are almost a big Satan for them.
Okay, Tony, where would you suggest they go? Because again,
go ahead.
Because
was Russian aid dependent on?
Go ahead, Tony. Go ahead.
Yeah, was Russian aid dependent on the rejection of the EU then?
I don't quite understand the question.
Was Russian aid dependent on rejecting the EU? Well, you've just said that Russia may now rethink its aid.
Dima, go ahead.
I think that the way Russia offered to make it is by small disbursements. The first disbursement is supposed to be 3 billion euros. It was not made dependent on the inclusion or not inclusion of Ukraine in this association agreement, but it's a goodwill of Russia. If Ukraine changes its government, if there is a coup d'etat, in fact, I think it's a coup d'etat in Ukraine, then why should Russia respect the agreements that were made with a government that doesn't exist anymore?
John, this is where, exactly where I want to go in this program, because it looks like, irrespective of how you feel about Mr. Yanukovych, is that, with the firing or the resignation of the government here, I mean, what is his political calculus here? Because the liberals in Kiev hate him. They've always hated him, okay, always. But what about his base in the east? Because is he decisive, indecisive? Does he have a plan? Because if you look at the way he dealt with the association agreement, one way you could look at it is that he made an abrupt decision, or if you step back and say, this guy was a smart guy because he played both sides against the middle and won, at least at the time. John, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty optimistic spin to put on it. I think it was a pretty badly managed decision, even if I can see why he took it. I think he should have, as Tony said earlier, he should have prepared his electorate longer, and he shouldn't have withdrawn his signature at the very last minute. But rationally, you're right. The decision would certainly, if he had signed the agreement, would have led to Ukraine's collapse. I think Yanukovych is quite a weak leader, as I said in my first remarks, and I think he presides over a very weak state. And ultimately, I think that these problems are, to some extent, intractable. They're intractable because Ukraine, unlike all the other post-Soviet states, has absolutely no national basis on which to construct a state. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, all the Soviet republics found themselves in front of a fait accompli, which was that they needed to set themselves up as states, even though many of them had never tried or sought for independence. And that was certainly the case of Ukraine. In the case of nearly all the other states, they have had some national basis, however artificial and however unpleasantly manipulated, on which to create a state. And that has not been the case with Ukraine, which doesn't have a national basis on which to create a state. Add to that the fact that it has this extremely weak geopolitical position, comparable perhaps to the traditional position of Poland between two great powers, Poland traditionally between Germany and Russia. Ukraine now, in a sense, has inherited that unfortunate geopolitical position. And the result is that when, as has happened, the European Union sets about on a very expansionist political agenda, geopolitical agenda, the Ukraine ultimately has become a sort of battlefield. And I think that these problems will not be resolved until the core problem is rooted out, and that is that the European Union abandons what I regard as a very anti-Russian geopolitical agenda and instead decides to get around a table with Russia to try to reconcile its own customs union with the Eurasian customs union.
Tony, you and I have been to Kiev many, many times over the years. I remember meeting you. You were going to the train station here in Moscow, and you were on your way to Kiev. You know both east and west of Ukraine, and we both know they're very, very different places. And every few years, we get this flare-up here. What can be an issue for compromise here? Because I know many, many people that have relatives in eastern Ukraine, and they just don't accept these people in the West. They're characterized very much how Dima Babich on the program has described them here. These are very different places. How do you keep it together?
Well, frankly, I don't think you resolve the current crisis in Ukraine by questioning the legitimacy of the Ukrainian state. It is what it is. Everybody living in Ukraine today was born in a country called Ukraine. The way to resolve the crisis that they face is to have elections to create legitimate basis for going further forward in
Tony, they keep having elections over and over and over again.
Well,
okay, I mean, this is a fetish. But it doesn't solve problems. It doesn't solve problems. It doesn't solve problems.
No, I think it does solve problems, because the striking thing about the current set of protests is that it's not limited to the West. You've seen them going on in Dnipropetrovsk, in Zaporizhzhia, and other cities as well in the north, in Kharkiv and elsewhere. So it's simply not the case that this is the West rising up against the Russian domination in the East. It's people who are fed up with what they perceive to be a corrupt regime who's doing very little to improve their living standards, and people are taking the opportunity, perhaps from the fact that the protest started with a different goal, which was over the European Union Association, but are using that opportunity now to express their own, maybe different discontents.
Dima, how do you look at that? This is an Go ahead.
I would agree with Tony on many points. I think that we should not question the legitimacy of the Ukrainian state. Different regions of Ukraine have very different historic destinies. Western Ukraine had never been a part of the Russian Empire. It was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then it became a part of Poland. But there are certain things which are constant. And I think whatever the suffering of West Ukrainians under the Polish occupation and then under the Stalin's rule, when Mr. Bandera, whom I show again, and his men started to cooperate with the German Nazis back in 1939, first against Poland, then against the Soviet Union, they made a pact with the devil. And the problem is that they are the only people in Europe, I mean, if you want political successors, are the only people in Europe who have not repented in any way for their cooperation with the Nazis. Even in Latvia or in Estonia or in Finland, people are somehow uneasy about this period of their history. They say we were forced to do it. In Western Ukraine, they say we're proud, everything was done right. And I think before we start to construct anything in Ukraine, or Ukrainians start to construct anything in Ukraine, they should clearly separate themselves from these kind of people. Because these people are not European, they are not Ukrainian, they are in fact unacceptable in any society. And it's a shame that the EU is shutting its eyes on that. And that the huge, I would say the majority of your European press pretends not to notice it.
John, the press pretends not to notice it. Again, these are, I mean, Dima is a very good historian. I know him very, very well, and he knows his history well here. And I see these posters also. I hear these chants, and it sends, my hair stands up in the back of my head. I can't believe in 2014 someone is marching in the streets of Ukraine saying these things.
With torches, with lighted torches, just like fascists did in 1933.
Yeah, and I mean, we had a big demonstration in Paris on Sunday, and the Interior Minister condemned the demonstrators as right-wing and extreme right-wing. And yet the idea that any of them would, for example, hold up a portrait of Marshal Pétain is completely incredible. So we are indeed dealing with a radicalism which has no equivalent, I think, anywhere else in Europe, except possibly in the Baltic states. I would say, on Tony's remark, I would say this. Surely the outcome to the crisis is to have a referendum on the European Accord. After all, that was the issue which triggered the crisis, and that is the issue which the Ukrainian people might be invited to vote upon. The opposition has never, as far as I know, called for such a referendum to be held, because I think it would probably lose it. And precisely what I think has made the situation worse is that the opposition, the opposition parties, have exploited this European issue and turned it into a simple struggle for power. And that is what has radicalized the situation on the ground, and that is what has led to the violence.
All right, in all fairness, gentlemen,
the best way out
we got 30 seconds. We got 30 seconds left. I want Tony to have the last word. Go ahead, Tony.
Well, surely any election that was called now for Parliament would effectively be such a referendum, because there would only be one issue. Are you voting for parties that favour reviving the association agreement with the EU, or for parties that wish to establish closer ties with Russia, as Mr. Yanukovych did? That's the nub of the crisis, and I think that would be the centre of any electoral campaign.
All right, that's a very good idea. Maybe they'll try it. Gentlemen, thank you very much. We've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Paris, London, and in Moscow. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules. I love you.